Imagine being watched, followed, and hunted, your every move tracked by someone you once trusted. Clare Bernal was living her dream until one man's obsession turned her life into a nightmare, leading to a terrifying and tragic end. This is the horrifying story of Clare Bernal. Clare Bernal was born on November 8, 1982, in the peaceful town of Tunbridge Wells, Kent. It was a quiet place where the rhythm of life flowed gently. Inside the Bernal household, however, something even more unique had arrived. From the moment Clare entered the world, there was a stillness about her, an almost eerie calm that set her apart from the other children her age. Unlike many kids, who filled their homes with noise and chaos, Clare moved quietly through her early years. She didn't throw tantrums or cause disruptions. Instead, she played quietly, often alone, fixated on the small, delicate toys that surrounded her. Her parents, Patricia and Martin Bernal, watched in silent curiosity as Clare spent hours with her dolls, not simply playing with them, but transforming them. It was in those early days, with tiny makeup brushes, clutched in her small hands, that Clare's future began to take shape. Patricia, her mother, recognized that this was more than a phase. Clare's artistic sense was undeniable, and Patricia, ever the supportive mother, nurtured it as best she could. She encouraged Clare's creativity, buying her small makeup kits. By the time Clare turned 12, her talent had transformed from simple curiosity into something extraordinary. She no longer just mimicked her mother, she surpassed her. Friends and family marveled at her skills, often inviting her to apply makeup for special occasions, even though she was still a child. Clare's reputation for beauty spread quickly among those who knew her. Her ability to transform a plain face into something radiant was nothing short of remarkable. In those moments, Clare herself felt it too. Her hands, steady and precise, moved with a confidence rare for her age. She knew without any doubt that the world of fashion and beauty was her future. It wasn't just a hobby, it was her calling. Clare Bernal had always known that dreams alone weren't enough. She understood, even at a young age, that success didn't come from wishing. It came from taking small, determined steps, no matter how invisible they seemed to others. In Tunbridge Wells, that quiet, tucked-away town, Clare's journey began in a local store, surrounded by ordinary things and ordinary people. But Clare was different. She knew her path led somewhere far beyond these small streets. It was here, amidst the quiet routine, that Clare met Adam Ward. Adam, with his lively presence, immediately saw something in her, a calmness, a simplicity that made her stand out. Adam felt it from the start. Clare was one of those rare people you don't meet often in life. He watched her, not with the gaze of a stranger, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who knew there was more beneath the surface. When Clare finally opened up to him, it was like peeling back the first layer of a tightly guarded secret. She spoke of her ambitions, her eyes gleaming with the same light as the makeup she so expertly applied. Fashion and beauty, she said, were her future, but not here, not in this sleepy town. Her dreams were bigger. London was calling her, and she would answer. One day, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'll be in London. This town, it's just the start. Days turned into weeks, and then one day Clare came to him, her usual calm shattered by excitement. It's happening, she breathed, her voice trembling. My dream, it's happening. Adam stared at her, confused at first. What do you mean? What's new? Harvey Nichols, she said, the name hanging in the air like a promise. They're looking for skincare consultants in London. London, Harvey Nichols. For Clare, this wasn't just a job. It was her chance to escape, to finally break free from the small-town life that had always felt too tight around her. She spoke quickly, her excitement spilling over, barely able to contain the thrill of what this opportunity meant. Moving to London, leaving her parents, becoming independent, it was all within reach now. In the days leading up to the interview, Clare threw herself into preparation. She filled pages with notes, researching every possible question they might ask. Adam watched her, sensing the intensity of her focus. He tried to help her, taking over some of her shifts at the shop. On the morning of the interview, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on everything beneath them. Clare clutched a stack of handwritten notes, her fingers trembling slightly as she reviewed the questions one last time. Adam stood beside her, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet anxiety. They arrived at Harvey Nichols, its grand entrance looming above them like the gateway to another world. Clare's face was pale, but determined and ready. Adam, always the loyal friend, insisted on waiting for her outside, even as the minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. For Adam, the wait felt endless, a gnawing worry twisting in his gut. But when Clare finally emerged, he saw it before she even spoke. Her eyes were shining, her expression a mixture of disbelief and triumph. "I did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "I got the job." The weight that had settled over Adam lifted instantly, replaced by a flood of pride for his friend. As they traveled back to Tunbridge Wells, the train rattling along the tracks, Clare's excitement didn't waver. She was already imagining her new life in London, the independence, the thrill of finally stepping into the world she had always dreamed of. Adam watched her, his thoughts heavy, knowing that this was the start of something much bigger than either of them realized. When Clare told her mother about the job, Patricia's heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She knew this day would come, but it didn't make the reality any easier. Her daughter was leaving, heading to the city, to a world filled with both opportunity and danger. But Patricia didn't show her worry. Instead, she smiled and hugged Clare tightly, her voice steady as she said, "You're ready for this. It's time for you to spread your wings." And so Clare's journey to London began. The city she had always dreamed of was now within her grasp. But what none of them could see, what none of them could predict, was the darkness waiting for her there. By November 2004, Clare Bernal's dream had come to life. Her new job at Harvey Nichols wasn't just a position. It was the gateway to the future she had always envisioned. She spent her first days in the bustling city, staying in cheap hotels, their rooms filled with the noise of distant traffic and the faint hum of excitement that London seemed to pulse with. It wasn't much, but to Clare, it was everything. Soon she met two other young women who also worked at Harvey Nichols. They were all in the same situation, new to the city, new to their independence. Together, they decided to pool their resources and found a place to rent in Dulwich Village. The house was modest, but the village was charming, lined with quiet streets and a sense of peacefulness that balanced out the chaos of central London. Clare finally had a place she could call her own. For Clare, this was more than just a step forward. It was a leap. She had a roof over her head that she paid for herself. She had broken free from the confines of her hometown and had launched herself into the arms of London. Everything felt alive. Every day was an adventure. Clare's days were filled with excitement, her nights often spent laughing with her new roommates or discovering hidden corners of the city. Almost every evening, she would call her mother, Patricia, to share stories of her newfound freedom. Whether it was a night out with friends, a new cafe she'd discovered, or the thrill of simply walking through the London streets, Clare always had something to tell. The happiness in her voice was unmistakable. She was spreading her wings, soaring higher with each passing day. But in December 2004, something shifted. A dark undercurrent began to weave its way into Clare's life, one that neither she nor anyone around her could foresee. Michael Petch, a security guard at Harvey Nichols, had always been in the background. For weeks, He had kept his distance, watching her with quiet admiration. Clare had never paid much attention to him. She wasn't the type to notice the lingering glances of men, her focus always on her work or her life outside the store. But one day, Michael decided to step out of the shadows. He approached her, his presence suddenly larger, more direct. His words were soft at first, harmless even. He complimented her clothes, the way she carried herself, letting his admiration spill into every sentence. Clare was caught off guard. It wasn't often that men approached her so openly at work. Michael's words seemed kind, gentle even, and when he asked if they could meet outside of work, she hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. At that moment, Clare couldn't have known that everything was about to change. What Clare saw in Michael was someone older, someone with a rugged charm, but what she didn't see was the dark truth that lingered beneath his exterior. Michael was no ordinary man. He had a past that he rarely spoke of. A former soldier in the Slovakian army, he had moved to Britain to escape the ruins of a failed marriage. His life had been one of strict control, of dominance, and his worldview was one of black and white. For Michael, life was about power, giving orders or receiving them. It was this sense of control that defined him, and Clare was about to become the target of that need. Later that evening, Clare finished her shift and, as always, called her mother. She mentioned the encounter with Michael, casually telling her mother and cousin about his admiration and his request for a date. Her cousin didn't think much of it. Clare had always attracted attention. With her beauty and quiet charm, men often found themselves drawn to her. But Patricia was more cautious. She had questions. How old was Michael? What did he look like? What kind of man was he? Clare didn't have much to say. She had only just met him, and besides, her mind was already on their upcoming date. When Clare met Michael, he was nothing short of prepared. His appearance was immaculate, clothes chosen carefully, his demeanor charming. From the moment they sat down, he showered Clare with compliments, his words flowing like honey, sweet and thick. For Clare, it was flattering. His admiration was genuine, or so it seemed. She felt happy in that moment, wrapped in the warmth of his attention. But when the date ended, Michael made an unusual request. He asked to see her again the next day. Clare hesitated. It felt rushed, sudden. But Clare had a tendency to want to please those around her, to avoid disappointment at all costs. She agreed. The following day after work, they met again. Once more, Michael poured his admiration over her, focusing on every detail of her appearance, her clothes, her smile. Clare found herself smiling in return, flattered by the attention, even as something small, almost imperceptible, stirred within her, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She pushed it aside. Then on the third day, Michael approached her at work. This time, it was different. He didn't wait for a quiet moment outside the store. He came to her in front of her colleagues, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. His voice was low, but his words were unmistakable. He told her that he had to confess something, that in the few days they had known each other, he had already fallen in love with her. Clare was stunned. Love? It had only been 3 days. They had barely spoken before that week. His words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Her colleagues exchanged glances, sensing something unusual, something unsettling in the way Michael spoke to her. Clare felt her heart race, a sudden wave of confusion washing over her. Clare Bernal had always been gentle, someone who found it hard to say no, who hated the thought of upsetting others. So when Michael Petch looked into her eyes and told her he loved her, after just 3 days, she smiled, not knowing what else to do. She didn't know how to confront such intense emotion, especially so quickly. Her smile, though hesitant, seemed to Michael like approval, like she had accepted the weight of his love, and that was all he needed. In the days that followed, Clare felt the confusion settle over her like a fog. The relationship had moved so quickly, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. The whirlwind of attention that had seemed flattering at first now left her feeling unsettled. Michael was always there, at work, at home, when she went out with her friends. It was as if he had wrapped himself around her life, smothering her with his constant presence. She couldn't breathe. Michael, on the other hand, was certain. In his mind, Clare was his to watch over, his to control. He followed her movements with the focus of a man who believed he owned her. His eyes always on her, his presence a shadow that never left. To Michael, Clare wasn't just someone he loved. She was his possession. Clare, in her growing discomfort, turned to the one person she trusted most, her mother. One evening, after yet another day of feeling suffocated by Michael's overbearing attention, Clare called Patricia. She tried to keep her voice steady, but there was no hiding the unease that had begun to creep into her heart. "Mom," she said quietly, "I don't know if I'm happy with Michael. He's everywhere. He won't leave me alone." Patricia listened carefully, her heart heavy with concern. She had always tried to be more of a friend than a strict mother to Clare, offering advice without judgment. And now, hearing the confusion in her daughter's voice, Patricia knew that something wasn't right. "Clare," Patricia said gently, "if you're not happy, you don't have to stay. But you need to think about what you want. Don't let him decide that for you." Clare wanted to avoid confrontation, to spare Michael's feelings. But with each passing day, Michael's behavior became harder to ignore. He was no longer just a protective boyfriend. He was watching her, following her, calling her constantly. Clare's silence, born out of a desire to avoid conflict, only fueled Michael's belief that he was in control. By the third week of their relationship, things had reached a boiling point. Michael was away visiting his family out of the country when he called Clare. His voice was cold, direct, more like a command than a request. He told her he was coming back and that she needed to meet him at the airport. Clare, who had grown weary of Michael's constant demands, explained calmly that it was impossible. She had work in the morning and couldn't get up at such an early hour just to pick him up. But Michael wouldn't take no for an answer. "You have to come," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I'm telling you to." It wasn't a question, it was an order. Clare felt like a soldier standing in front of a superior officer, forced to comply. And in that moment, she realized the depth of Michael's control over her. Still, her kind nature won out. She agreed, even though the thought of going made her feel sick. When she met him at the airport, Michael was carrying large bags, his eyes gleaming with expectation. But when he asked to stay at her place that night, Clare drew the line. Her gentle smile still in place, she told him it wasn't possible. She wasn't comfortable having him stay with her when she hadn't yet made up her mind about their relationship. Michael's eyes darkened, disbelief clouding his features. He hadn't expected her to refuse. To him, her refusal was an insult, a direct challenge to the control he believed he had. He told her he wasn't leaving, that he would stay the night, whether she liked it or not. In that moment, Clare realized just how deep Michael's need for control ran. But worn down by exhaustion and unable to summon the strength to fight, she gave in. She let him stay through the air between them was thick with tension. The next morning, Clare escorted Michael to the train station. She hoped this would be the end of it, that he would leave, and she could have some space to think. But Michael, standing on the platform, didn't board the train. He stood there, staring at Clare, his eyes filled with a cold certainty. He wasn't leaving. His look said everything. He was the one in charge here. He was the one who gave the orders, and Clare was expected to follow. But Clare had finally had enough. Something inside her snapped as she looked back at him. The realization that this relationship was toxic, that it was suffocating her, overwhelmed her. She couldn't do this anymore. Not with him. "I'm going home," she said, her voice steady, her gaze hardening. You do whatever you want, Michael." Her words cut through the air like a knife. Michael's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling into a tight, angry line. He understood the message behind Claire's words. For the first time, he was no longer in control. He wasn't the one giving orders anymore. As Clare turned and walked away, Michael's mind raced. He wasn't the kind of man to sit back and accept defeat. Not now. Not ever. Instead of giving her space, he pursued her, calling her phone repeatedly. 20 times he tried to reach her, each call going unanswered. His anger grew with every ring that went to voicemail. By the time Michael arrived at Claire's house, his rage was boiling over. He stood outside, fuming, his fists clenched. He demanded to see her, to speak to her, but Claire's friends were there, and they refused to let him in. They told him to leave her alone, that Clare didn't want to see him. But Michael wouldn't leave. He stood there, seething, for what felt like hours. Finally, after being shut out, humiliated, and furious, he left, his mind consumed with shame and anger. From the moment Clare rejected Michael at the train station, she unknowingly became his target. No longer just an ex-girlfriend, she was now his obsession, a prize he was determined to reclaim by any means necessary. Michael, a man who had once served in the military, took on a new mission, a mission far more personal and twisted, to monitor Claire's every move, every breath, and every smile. As the security guard at Harvey Nichols, he had access to all the tools he needed. He watched her through the mirrors on the sales floor, catching glimpses of her as she worked, speaking to customers, smiling at them in a way that twisted something dark inside him. When she wasn't within his sight, he followed her through the store's surveillance cameras, tracking her every step. Who was she talking to? Was she smiling? Was she thinking about him? His mind was a prison of jealousy, and every second she spent ignoring him only fueled his growing rage. Despite the creeping feeling of being watched, Clare tried to go about her work as usual, but there was no escaping Michael. He approached her again, his tone more insistent this time, asking for another chance. But Clare had already made up her mind. She didn't want him in her life. Ignoring his pleading words, she walked away, her heart racing with each step. But Michael wasn't done. He turned to her friends at work, trying to enlist their help, painting a picture of a man desperate for reconciliation. He was persuasive, telling them he just wanted to talk to Clare, just wanted to be friends again. Some of her co-workers, feeling sorry for Michael, suggested Clare speak to him. Maybe a friendly conversation would ease the tension. Maybe it would help him move on. Reluctantly, Clare considered it. She consulted her mother, Patricia, who also believed that talking to Michael might diffuse the situation. But this wasn't a normal breakup, and Michael was far from a normal ex-boyfriend. When Clare finally agreed to speak to him again, hoping to end things on civil terms, it only made things worse, much worse. For Michael, her willingness to talk wasn't a gesture of closure. It was an open door. He believed he still had a chance, that all he had to do was push a little harder, get a little closer. The text messages started flooding in, dozens a day. At first, they were simple, full of compliments and casual chatter, but soon they became unsettling. He acted as though they were still together, as though Clare hadn't ended things. He wished her a happy Valentine's Day. He flirted with her relentlessly, even when she told him to stop. 50 messages a day, sometimes more. Clare's phone buzzed constantly, each new message from Michael a reminder that she was never really free. She tried to ignore him, but Michael's persistence only grew. Eventually, Clare had enough. She confronted him, telling him to stop, to leave her alone, that their relationship was over for good. For Michael, her rejection wasn't just a dismissal, it was an insult. Her words wounded his pride, and in his mind, they were nothing less than a declaration of war. If Clare wouldn't be his, then he would make sure she couldn't escape him. He took his surveillance to another level. Now, it wasn't just at work where he watched her. He followed her outside too. Every time she turned a corner, there he was, lurking just out of reach, but never hidden. He didn't even try to conceal himself. He wanted her to know. He wanted her to feel his presence. Clare's life spiraled into a constant state of fear. Everywhere she went, she felt his eyes on her. She would glance over her shoulder, and there he would be, standing on the other side of the street, just watching. It was as if he was always waiting for her. The terror grew each day, and Clare could no longer ignore it. The breaking point came one evening after work. As Clare hurried toward the exit, trying to escape before he could approach her, Michael intercepted her. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, and his face was inches from hers. "I know you love me," he whispered, his voice low and unnervingly calm. Clare pulled her arm back, trying to break free. "I don't love you, Michael. Stop following me. Just leave me alone." But Michael's grip tightened, his eyes burning with something twisted and possessive. "I know you love me," he repeated, his voice growing darker. Fear shot through Clare like ice. She wrenched her arm free and fled, her heart pounding as she made her way to the train station, her mind racing with thoughts of how to finally escape him. Maybe now he'd understand. Maybe now he'd see that she wanted nothing to do with him. But Michael wasn't done. As she boarded the train, her chest still heaving with the panic of the encounter, she tried to collect herself. The train doors slid shut, and Clare allowed herself a breath, believing that she had left him behind for the night. The carriage was quiet, the dim lights casting long shadows across the empty seats. But then, she saw him. Sitting directly across from her, his eyes locked on hers. Michael, he had followed her. He had made sure to catch the same train. The fear she had tried so hard to bury welled up inside her, threatening to spill over. She could feel his gaze boring into her, his presence unnervingly close. She forced herself to speak, her voice steady, despite the terror roiling inside her. "If you don't stop, I'll go to the police." Michael didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath hot against her skin. And then, with a chilling smile that sent a wave of dread coursing through her, he whispered, "If you go to the police, I'll kill you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clare sat frozen, her mind reeling, her pulse thundering in her ears. Michael's cold smile stayed with her long after he had stepped off the train. Clare Bernal was no stranger to fear by this point, but Michael's whispered threat on the train took that fear to a new and terrifying level. When she finally made it home, her hands were shaking as she fumbled for her keys, her heart racing as she locked the door behind her. The first thing she did was call her mother. Patricia, who had always been Clare's rock, could hear the fear in her daughter's voice, a trembling tone she had never heard before. "He said he would kill me." Patricia's heart sank. The protective instinct surged through her. What had once seemed like a disturbing infatuation had now become something far more dangerous, a death threat. Patricia wanted to tell Clare to go to the police right away, but she hesitated. What evidence did Clare have? It was just her word against his, and Michael was always careful. He was always watching, but never leaving proof. The situation felt impossible. Clare's roommates could see the toll it was taking on her. The vibrant, independent woman they had moved in with was unraveling before their eyes. She was constantly on edge, collapsing into tears at the smallest trigger. They decided that enough was enough. They wouldn't stand by while Clare's life became a living nightmare. The next day, they went straight to the security manager at Harvey Nichols. They told him everything: Michael's stalking, his obsession, the way he seemed to haunt Clare's every move. The manager, sensing the gravity of the situation, decided to investigate himself. He went to the security room, where the store's cameras could be rewound and reviewed. One camera was set to follow Michael's movements, another set to track Clare. As the footage rolled, the truth became clear. Michael was not just watching Clare, he was fixated on her. Every movement she made, he shadowed. The manager was horrified by what he saw. That same day, Michael was informed that his shifts would be changed, ensuring he wouldn't cross paths with Clare at work anymore. But even this didn't stop Michael. His obsession went beyond work hours. It wasn't about proximity anymore. It was about control. He continued to stalk Clare outside of work, appearing in places she thought were safe, following her home, making sure she knew she was never alone. The toll this took on Clare was enormous. She became a shadow of herself, her once bright, carefree smile now gone. She was late to work almost every day, kept up by endless, sleepless nights filled with fear. When she did make it in, she was distracted, her mind a whirl of terrifying thoughts. The clients who used to be drawn to her for her skincare advice now noticed her distant, absent expression. Things took an even darker turn when one day, in a casual conversation with a coworker, Michael asked a chilling question. "What's the penalty for murder in Britain?" His friend froze. The question wasn't posed like a joke, not even out of curiosity. There was a coldness in Michael's voice, an unnerving seriousness that set off alarm bells. The friend, pale-faced and shaken, immediately reported the conversation to the security manager. The security manager knew it was time for Clare to take action. He pulled her aside, his tone serious, urging her to stop worrying about hurting Michael's feelings. It was time to protect herself. He pleaded with her to go to the police, to stop living in fear. Clare finally saw what everyone around her had been telling her. It was time. She could no longer handle this on her own. On April 1st, Clare went to the police. Her heart raced as she recounted every terrifying moment, every sickening glance, and every threat Michael had made. The police listened carefully, taking down her statement, promising to investigate further. The days dragged on, and Clare waited, holding her breath. On April 6th, her manager summoned Michael to the store. But when Michael arrived, the police were waiting. They placed him under arrest. But as they led him away, Michael's eyes locked onto Clare's. He gave her that smile again, a cold, twisted grin that sent shivers down her spine. It was as if he was telling her, "This isn't over yet." The relief that swept through the store was palpable. Her co-workers exhaled, finally feeling like the nightmare was ending. But not Clare. Inside, a storm of guilt and fear raged. She called her mother, her voice trembling once again. "I feel like this is my fault. He's angry, and it's because of me." Patricia tried to reassure her, but nothing could shake Clare's growing anxiety. Michael had been charged with stalking her and was issued a non-molestation order. Legally, he couldn't come near her again, nor could he contact her. His manager at work suspended him immediately, enforcing the law. But despite all of this, Clare's fear hadn't eased. Something inside her knew Michael wouldn't stop. Clare and her roommates decided to move to a new apartment. They couldn't risk Michael knowing where she lived. They packed their things quickly, trying to leave no trace behind. But the terror was far from over. As Clare packed, the doorbell rang. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she opened the door, and there he was. Michael stood before her, his eyes filled with that same chilling determination. Clare's heart raced as she slammed the door shut and immediately called the police. By the time they arrived, Michael had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his presence and the suffocating fear that followed. The police searched for him, but found nothing. There was no trace of him, no evidence he had even been there. 4 days later, on April 10th, Clare thought she might finally be safe in her new apartment. But that morning, when she stepped onto her balcony, her heart nearly stopped. There he was again. Michael, standing outside, watching her from across the street. Claire ducked out of sight, her hands trembling as she called the police once more. This time they arrived quickly. As the officers led Michael away, he turned to Claire, his face twisted into that same terrifying smile. It was as if he enjoyed the fear he was inflicting, as if her terror was feeding something deep and dark within him. By April 19th, the tables had finally turned. Michael, the man who had terrorized Claire for months, was officially charged with threatening to kill. When Claire learned of his arrest, it was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She could finally breathe again. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a path to safety. Michael had been released on bail, but knowing that he was awaiting trial gave her some sense of closure. He couldn't reach her now, she thought. His ability to torment her was over. For weeks, Michael vanished from Claire's life. The silence was a gift, and slowly, bit by bit, Claire began to return to herself. The smile that had once faded returned. She was finally able to laugh again, her voice no longer trembling with the shadow of fear. Her mother, Patricia, watched this transformation with relief. Claire was getting her life back, and Patricia, seeing her daughter grow stronger, decided to celebrate this moment with her. They took a trip together, 5 days in the sun-drenched paradise of Italy. It was a trip filled with love, laughter, and the kind of peace they hadn't experienced in months. Claire, now 22, was blossoming once again. She returned to work with renewed energy, determined to make up for all the time she had lost. Life, for the first time in a long while, felt normal again. But Claire didn't know that, while she was reclaiming her future, the monster lurking in the shadows was planning something much darker. After his release on bail, Michael vanished from Claire's life. What no one knew at the time was that his disappearance wasn't a sign of defeat. It was preparation. He had returned to Slovakia, but not for a simple visit. Michael was undergoing weapons training, preparing for a mission of his own, one of vengeance and destruction. While Claire was rebuilding her life, Michael was in the process of ensuring that she wouldn't live to enjoy it. In Slovakia, he trained himself on handling firearms, his mind singularly focused on one goal: to kill Claire. He was meticulous. His training complete, Michael was able to obtain a pistol. Smuggling the firearm back into Britain, unnoticed by border guards, he returned with a renewed sense of purpose. No longer a man pleading for Claire's affection, Michael had transformed into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. The court date was set for August 31st, a day that Claire both dreaded and longed for. It was meant to be her moment of justice, but the lawyers advised her to drop the case. They explained that proving a threat to kill without hard evidence would be almost impossible. And in truth, Claire didn't want to stand in court and face Michael. The thought of looking him in the eye again sent chills down her spine. Reluctantly, she agreed to withdraw the case. Michael walked away with no charges, no imprisonment, just a fine or community service. For Claire, it was a small price to pay to be done with the nightmare. She was relieved, happy even, that it was over. She believed the threat had passed. That chapter of her life, she thought, had finally ended. But the monster was still out there. 13 days after the court hearing, the air was heavy with a sense of calm. It was just another day at Harvey Nichols. Claire moved through her shift like she had done 100 times before, greeting customers, offering skincare advice, her confidence back in full bloom. Her friends at work could see it too. The light in her eyes had returned. Around 8 p.m., as the store's closing time approached, Claire's friend glanced at the clock and smiled. 10 minutes left, and we're out of here, her friend said, with a playful grin. Claire returned the smile, her face glowing with the ease that had been absent for so long. She glanced down at her watch, but when she looked up, her blood turned to ice. Michael was standing there, just a few feet away. He had slipped through the back doors of the store, unseen, unnoticed. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Claire's body went cold, her vision blurring. She could feel her legs giving way beneath her. The shock, the disbelief, it all hit her at once, and she collapsed to the floor. But Michael wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to beg for another chance. He pulled a gun from beneath his coat, the very weapon he had smuggled back into Britain, and pointed it directly at her. Without hesitation, he fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the store, followed by 2 more shots. Claire's body lay motionless on the ground, 3 bullets lodged in her head. Michael stood over her for a moment, the silence of the store amplifying the horror of what had just occurred. Then, without a word, he turned the gun on himself. The final shot rang out, and Michael's body crumpled to the ground beside Claire's, his life ending in an instant. Later, a toxicology report would reveal that Michael had taken a large amount of cocaine before the attack, his mind warped by the drugs and his obsession. Claire's body was taken to the hospital, but the worst news still had to be delivered. It was nearly midnight when Patricia returned home from a friend's birthday celebration, unaware that her daughter was gone. The knock on the door shattered the calm of the night. When she opened it, 2 officers stood before her, their faces grim. "Your daughter has been killed," they told her. The shock reverberated through the family and friends, as if an angel had been stolen from the world too soon. Clare had left behind a love letter to life, but Michael had destroyed it with a single act of brutal vengeance. Devastated but determined, Patricia refused to let her daughter's death be in vain. She launched a campaign, a personal crusade, to raise awareness about the dangers of stalking and to fight for change. She quickly learned that Clare was far from the only victim. There were countless others, women who had faced similar terror, many of whom had met tragic ends. Patricia's fight gained momentum, and soon her voice became impossible to ignore. She pressured the government to change the laws surrounding stalking, and eventually her campaign led to real change. Stalking became a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. But for Patricia, no law could bring Clare back. Her daughter was gone, but her legacy would live on through the lives of other women, protected by the changes her mother had fought so hard for. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. 95% of our viewers haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing. It really helps support the channel, and you won't miss any of our future videos. Thanks for your support.